Hi, and welcome back to Module 4, where we are going to talk about symbolic sport. In this module, we'll be covering two chapters, one from GEMS in Chapter 7 and one from Wiggins in Chapter 9. Throughout this module, we'll be discussing how sport ultimately shaped American culture. And in this time, we'll be thinking about the years of roughly 1900 through about 1920. As I mentioned in the prior slide, sport helped shape American culture. And we will begin to talk about going forward, sport was used as a quest for social or upward mobility. And I read, in a culture that was greatly impacted by class privilege and wealth, sport was deemed meritocratic or based upon skill. Many groups viewed sport as a way to assimilate and gain respect within their own culture as well as other cultures. In addition, many ethnic groups tried to maintain their old world sporting practices through competing and playing sports that they had known from the old world. So what did this notion of sport as a quest for social mobility look like on the ground? Couple of ways, and I like how this slide details it. First of all, boxing was known for its toughness, and it ultimately allowed different racial groups to earn social capital. Baseball offered many opportunities, whether it was in the majors, the minors, semi-pro, or even industrial leagues. Bowling proved to be fashionable among middle class. There were even leagues and prizes for men and women. Billiards proved to be profitable for some of the best players, and this surrounded a lot of wagering and or gambling. Finally, saloons offered concerts, vaudeville, and boxing matches. While laborers typically liked prize fighting, former athletes often became saloon owners. Remember, sport was a way to make money or move up the social ladder. As we've talked about prior, sport served as a way to indicate social mobility. Also, for outside groups, sport served as a way to assimilate or be part of the main group. We're going to look at a few different cultural groups going forward to talk about how these outside groups were assimilated through sport. First, let's talk about Native Americans. For these Native Americans, whether they wanted to or not, sport and education was used to ultimately force assimilation. One of the things that was interesting is this notion of Carlisle schools, which were instituted to assimilate Native Americans. Carlisle schools even played football, and you can see on that right-hand side that they almost beat Harvard and then Yale, and ultimately beat Penn in 1899. Point of this being, sport was used as ways for outside groups to be assimilated to the culture. In the same way that Native Americans were on the outside, African Americans also experienced a great disadvantage in early sport. However, there were a number of black sporting entrepreneurs that emerged and provided unique areas for blacks to participate. For example, in baseball, the Negro National League led the charge and allowed black baseball players to compete. There were some jockeys, and I listed them here, Isaac Murphy, Willie Sims, and Jim Wakefield. They experienced some success. Cycling, one of the most famous cyclers of the time was Marshall or Major Taylor. He was an African American man. Probably some of the most famous areas we see sport as assimilation for African Americans was in boxing. At this era, Jack Johnson was very successful, although he was often denied title bouts against Caucasians. Football proved or offered more mobility for some group. We saw these for Pollard and Robeson. Lastly, basketball was still much of a social event. It was typically still played in dance halls, Ys, and churches, although we will see where that will gain popularity for African Americans going forward. The start of the 20th century was marked with a strong push for social change, and one of the places we saw that push for social change was the challenge to gender boundaries. First of all, suffrage, or women's right to vote. Although women had had 17 referenda failed from roughly 1870 to 1910, they ultimately would receive the right to vote in 1920. In addition to voting, more women were entering the workforce. Thus, there was less reliance on men to complete jobs, and in addition, women had less reliance on men to provide. Finally, also throughout this time, there were a number of key females that were activists, and I've listed them here. In just a minute, we'll talk a little bit about how sport also served as a way to challenge gender boundaries. In the next couple of slides, we're going to lay out how sport served as a way to challenge gender boundaries. In roughly, again, the early 20th century, 1900 to about 1920, the access to facilities for women increased. This allowed more opportunities for women to be active in physical activity and exercise. In addition, as we've talked about prior, women's college teams offered college sport for women. Those were specifically at Vassar, Mills, and Wellesley. In addition, we saw physical cultural classes that emphasized this notion of camaraderie over competition, but at the end, it allowed girls the opportunity to be physically active. Throughout the early 20th century, there were a number of common myths and misconceptions that prevented women from being active in physical activity and sport. First, one of those myths was that exertion was going to cause nervous breakdowns, damage reproductive organs, and that a female body was simply unable to handle exertion. Second, women were thought to have smaller brains and therefore intellectually inferior. Third, there was a fear that women would ultimately stray away from motherhood, and thus the number of white Anglo-Saxon children would decrease. And finally, throughout this era, the bicycling fad was on the rise. Many were concerned that women would have lower sexual impulses if they took part in bicycling. Our last slide on the concept of sport as challenge to gender boundaries is going to consider how sport and physical activity participation in and of itself challenged our typical notions of domesticity and fashion. One of the key figures to lead this charge was Annie Oakley. She took on a non-traditional domestic role and one that challenged traditional gender boundaries. Also, throughout this early 20th century, female baseball players took part in barnstorming teams. This again challenged our traditional notions of domesticity and fashion. Also throughout this era, tennis, golf, and cycling increased. In addition to that, as women became more competitive and more willing to participate, they wanted to be able to do so in a safe and comfortable fashion. And in that, they changed apparel. They began to wear more masculine clothing that allowed them to participate freely and more competitively. That, in and of itself, ultimately again challenged our typical gender boundaries. Sport took on a very specific role during World War I. First of all, physical training manuals were produced and used to maintain physical fitness, one of the general public and two of the soldiers. In addition, competition was used to help maintain camaraderie and nationalism. Sport was used for social control of soldiers, and even our Boy Scouts adopted military fitness and mandatory physical fitness in schools following the war. Pope in Wiggins chapter 9 tells of how military made sport and athletic training a key component in preparing for war. It's also really important to note that this connection between sport and athletic training and war did not just happen overnight, but has been a common thread throughout our wartime history. However, throughout World War I, it was prominent or on the forefront. In addition, Pope highlights that not only sport was used for military training, but had some other key principles as well. It served as goodwill, it served as a place for camaraderie, and it also served as a place for individuals to be patriotic or nationalist. And here we are to the end of our lecture on Module 4. Again, here are some questions for thought. Use it as fact-checked and application as ways to help you prepare going forward.